We're going to be in Acts chapter 7 this evening. And as we open up to Acts chapter 7, we're going to continue looking at Stephen's address to the Sanhedrin, that ruling member of a ruling body that consisted of priests and high priests and elders in the Jewish temple, specifically the temple community. And we know that they've been irked and they've been their toes have been stepped on a little bit, because we see the church flourishing. We see the gospel going forth, and we saw at the end of chapter 6 that a great many number of the near 8,000 priests who served in the temple had followed after Jesus. Now that's a problem if you are the ones who crucified Jesus, if you are the ones who falsely accused Jesus, if you're the ones who ultimately are trying to stamp out the movement of Jesus. When your own people start following Jesus, then you have a problem. And so they have to quiet this rebellion against Judaism, if you will, by preaching of Christ. And so they arrest this man Stephen, a man full of wisdom and the Holy Spirit, a man full of grace, who could debate like none other. They falsely accuse him, and they bring him before the Sanhedrin. And last week we saw, as Stephen addresses them, this intense reminder of who they are as Hebrews, who they are as the Jewish nation. He says, don't you remember that you come from Abraham? And if you remember who Abraham was, he was called out of a foreign land, out of Ur, which would be in Chaldea, and told to come and go to a land that I will show you. So Abraham himself was chosen by God, called to go to a land that he would show him, and then in the process made Abraham a promise. And that promise was that he would make him a great nation. He would make his name great, that he would bless those that blessed him, curse those that cursed him. And in the process of all of this, the world would be blessed through him. You see, that's what Abraham was given the promise of. And we know the story of Abraham. Abraham was kind of a normal human being. He had his moments of doubt, which we are going to see play into what part of the story we're going to read tonight. But we also see a man who had to trust in the promise of God. We looked at Genesis chapter 15 last week, where it said, and Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him for righteousness. It was counted to him. That's the same word used for, in the New Testament, reckon. It means to have righteousness credited to you. So he looked at the promise of God, and in Genesis chapter 15, we see that he believed God. He believed what God said. He trusted God. And so Stephen does this eloquent thing in bringing the Sanhedrin back to this realization that it was Abraham who had to trust God. And now you stand here claiming, basically, that because you're a descendant of Abraham, you think you're going to get into heaven. You think you're going to be declared righteous as he was declared righteous. You think because you have the covenant of circumcision, which was designed to set you apart and remind you of the covenant that God made with Abraham, that you can automatically be justified and earn your seat in heaven. And he says, no, it's just like Abraham. You're justified by faith and faith alone. That is a doctrine that we still hold to today. That is a doctrine we still preach. You're not saved by works, you're saved by faith. Because if you're saved by works, according to Ephesians chapter 2, then you have reason to boast before God, don't you? But Stephen tells the Sanhedrin, no, it isn't so. And we looked at the end last week, and basically, as we closed out, and it says, and he gave him the covenant of circumcision, and Abraham became the father of Isaac, and Isaac circumcised him on the 8th day, and Isaac became the father of Jacob, and Jacob the 12 patriarchs. Now, we kind of went over those names. If you guys want those, we can give them to you again. But for sake of time, we're just gonna realize that he had 12 sons, which became the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay, now these are the 12 tribes that still exist, still have descendants to this day. We know that in Revelation, there's going to be 12,000 from each one of these tribes, each one of these descendants who's going to be marked out and untouchable during the Great Tribulation period. And so God will keep his promise to his people, even though they're benched for the time being because of their rejection of Christ. Now, without getting sidetracked, we're going to try to endeavor to go through a few verses tonight in the sermon of Stephen. So as we read in the end of verse 8 that there are 12 sons who became the 12 tribes, but Stephen now takes a different path with these, and he says, okay, let's talk about these patriarchs. Let's talk about these ones that oftentimes we as Jewish people hold in such high regard. Okay, now this is important because the Jewish heritage was so important. They actually say, like, if you go and read the Gospels, you know how Matthew and Luke record those genealogies? It was such an important thing to them that you could actually go and trace your heritage, your descendants, all the way back to one of these 12 guys. That's how serious they were about it. So they kept such a detailed record, they could go back and they say, no, I'm of the tribe of Reuben, or I'm of the tribe that was stemmed from Levi or Daniel, or, you know what I mean? They could actually trace that heritage back. It was so important to them. But now Stephen shifts gears and he says, well, let's talk about God's faithful provision for the nation of Israel through the patriarchs. Now, in verse 9 it says, and the patriarchs, jealous of Joseph, sold him into Egypt, but God was with him. I want us to jump back to Genesis chapter 37, if you will. Because we can read that and we can go, okay, well, I kind of know what that story is. We actually spent a week a couple of years ago in Vacation Bible School looking at the story of Joseph. It's one of my favorite Old Testament stories and accounts because you really see God's provision as he faithfully takes care of Joseph, and how he uses Joseph to take care of the nation. So in Genesis chapter 37, verse 9, it says, then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said. So we want to know right away as we begin reading, this is the second dream that he's had, okay? The second dream. The first one just kind of irked his brother. Can you imagine that? Your little brother comes up to you and keeps telling you about these dreams where they're all going to be bowing down to him. And I don't know if little brothers and little sisters are kind of like the ones that just, in my family, you just got picked on. I got picked on by my older sister, so I picked on my little brother. And then 10 years later, my little sister came along, and then she was everybody's favorite. Nobody picked on her. But I picked on my brother, and then if my brother would have come and told me something like Joseph told his brothers, I mean, I probably would have beat him up pretty good too. But he says, behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me. Now, it doesn't take rocket science to figure out, his brothers to figure out, well, there's 11 of us and there's mom and dad. Okay, so we're bowing down to me. But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, what is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you? And his brothers, catch this, were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. So he goes, and right away his brothers are jealous and they're angry with him because of what he's just said. This is not the first time, but the second time. And so you can imagine they're just a little bit miffed as daddy's golden little child is telling them, hey, you're going to bow down to me one day. So as we continue reading in verse 12, it says, now his brothers went to pasture with his father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. And they said to them, or he said to him, here am I. So he said to him, go see it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word. So he sent him to the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem, and a man found him wandering in the fields. And the man asked him, what are you seeking? I'm seeking my brothers, he said. Tell me, please, where are they pasturing the flock? And he said to them, they have gone away, for I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. And so Joseph went up after his brothers and found them at Dothan. Now this is where the story starts to take a turn for the worst, or at least it seems to be a turn for the worst for Joseph. They saw him afar, and before he came near, they conspired against him to kill him. And they said to one another, here comes the dreamer. Come, now let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. I'll tell you what, my brother, yeah, sometimes he irritated me. Sometimes I just wanted to beat the tar out of him, but I never actually sat down and plotted how I could get rid of him. So these brothers are kind of messed up. I'm just going to put that. But what's interesting here, and one of the things I want us to know, is that when we see this kind of behavior, what was it that sparked this? It was these dreams. And what was that emotion, the sinful emotion that they felt towards Joseph? What was it? Jealousy. And that festered and festered and festered to the point where they, as his brothers, actually said, how can we get rid of this kid? Let us throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams. But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, let us not take his life. And Reuben said to them, shed no blood, throw him into the pits here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand and restore him to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, that coat of many colors that he wore, and they took him and threw him into the pit. The pit was empty and there was no water in it. Well, that was nice. At least they picked an empty one. Very thoughtful, brothers. Then they sat down to eat. This blows my mind. I don't even know how we just threw our brother in the pit. We just talked about killing him. Let's have dinner. So they sit down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of the Ishmaelites. Who is the other born son of Abraham? I hear whispers. What is this whispering? Ishmael. These are the descendants of Ishmael that have now come and are on their way to Egypt. Can you imagine that? This was literally the fruit of Abraham and Sarah's doubting of God. But isn't it interesting how God can take something that was born literally out of a doubting heart and use it to further his plan for prospering his nation? Now, so these Ishmaelites are coming from Gilead, and their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, what profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. Oh, look, isn't that such a turn of heart? This is our brother, our own flesh. We could not kill him, but let's sell him, because then at least we can get something for it. I mean, this is just, man. When we let sin run rampant in our hearts, it does strange things to our hearts and minds, doesn't it? And his brothers listened to him. Then the Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt. This is where Stephen brings us back to. He says, look, this is where our history lies. The patriarchs, jealous of Joseph, sold him into Egypt. You see, but God wasn't done with Joseph just yet. In fact, doesn't it say in verse 9 that God was with him? This is the thing we need to know and understand as we kind of move forward, that if God is with us, then we need to trust that his plan is perfect for us. Do you think Joseph woke up in the morning that day thinking, man, I really hope I get to go to Egypt today? No. He was going to hopefully go back and report to his dad that all was good. But yet God had a different plan, a plan that even though he couldn't see the full extent of it, that God was working in the background, not only to preserve Joseph, but to preserve his family as well, and ultimately the line which the promised Messiah was to come through. And so in verse 10 of Acts chapter 7, if you turn back there, keep your finger in Genesis. It says, but God was with him and rescued him out of all his afflictions and gave him favor and wisdom before Pharaoh, king of Egypt, who made him ruler over Egypt and over all his household. Now, for sake of time, we're not going to go into the rest of Genesis, but in Genesis chapter 39, verses 1 through 4, we see that as soon as Joseph is in Egypt, he's bought by a man named Potiphar. Now, Potiphar was an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. He was pretty high up. He had a lot of pull, and he sees Joseph, and he buys him from the Ishmaelites, and he brings him into his home. And he could see, according to verse 2 of chapter 39, that the Lord was with him, that everything he did prospered. Isn't that a great testimony? That when God is with us, point in case, what Dave shared, that, like, here's fresh fallen snow. What are the odds that he's going to find this little tiny washer the size of your thumbnail that you need to put your brakes back together? But when we trust God, he's with us. He's working. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to be the richest of people, does it? When God prospers what you do, it doesn't mean that you're going to have wealth, and the Bible never speaks to that. But it could be those little things. And Potiphar took notice that God was working in all that Joseph did. And that everything he did was prospering, not because of Joseph, but because God was with him. And so this Egyptian Potiphar takes Joseph and sets him over his entire household, over the affairs of all things. Now, Joseph was kind of this young, studly looking guy. And he would walk around basically wearing a towel in our modern equivalent. So he's walking around the house, but it was normal garb. They just had this kind of flowy skirt thing that they would wear. And so he was probably walking around with his muscles hanging out. And you could understand why Potiphar's wife goes, wow, that's a good-looking Hebrew guy. Now, this woman is not a godly woman. This woman is not I would even say a good person at this point in her life, as she is looking at the servants of her husband, Potiphar, and saying, I would like to engage in illicit, inappropriate behavior outside of the confines of my marriage with one of my husband's slaves. You see, that's the way this woman was, and she had her eye on Joseph, and Joseph continually rejected that until one day he finds himself alone with her, and she comes on to him, and he says, I'm out of here, and he takes off, and she grabs that wonderful little bathrobe that kept him covered, and he goes tearing off out of there, and he knows he's in trouble. Because it's kind of hard if you have no clothes on and the lady who's accusing you of trying to come on to her has your clothes to argue otherwise. And so Potiphar comes home and he says, what is going on? Well, that servant of yours, he tried to come on to me, his wife says, and so he has Joseph thrown in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph, was he not? Joseph's in prison for a while, and what happens to Joseph in prison? Eventually, he kind of becomes one of the faithful prisoners, and he kind of gets put in charge of other prisoners. And one day, these two guys come in that had been thrown in jail by Pharaoh, and they had these kind of crazy dreams. One about birds eating, and the other one about prospering things. And so Joseph interprets it. He says, you'll be restored, but don't worry, you don't have such good luck. The Pharaoh's going to kill you, and the birds are going to eat your flesh. And he tells the one guy who's going to make it, he says, when you stand before Pharaoh, remember me. Now you think that'd be a good thing, right? When he goes and all the things are fulfilled, hey, there's this guy Joseph in prison. He told me all this is going to happen. You should probably let him out. But it doesn't happen. It says, in fact, in Genesis chapter 40, it says that for 2 years, Joseph remained in prison. At this point in time, how many of you guys are giving up? I'm done. If you guys have been watching any of the morning devotions, we've been talking about steadfastness. That idea of enduring and remaining through hardship. You want a picture of steadfastness, it's right here in Genesis. Joseph remained faithful to God as he was sold into slavery, as he was lied about, as he was thrown in prison, and then waited there for 2 years until Pharaoh has a bad dream. A dream he can't understand. Where there's some fat corn and some lean corn and some fat cows and some lean cows, and the lean cows eat up all the fat cows, and I don't know, how many of you guys ever had weird dreams like that? Anybody?
Yeah.
Okay, our dreams usually stem after we've watched something or seen something, and then we have these weird dreams that happen afterwards. But this dream was given to Pharaoh by God for a purpose. To not only deliver Joseph out of the pit of prison, but to lift him up into a place of power and prominence within the Egyptian government. You see, In verse 25 of chapter 40, Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. These two dreams that you had, they're the same dream. He says, God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years. And the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh, God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, but after them there will arise 7 years of famine. And all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown to the land by reason of famine that will follow. For it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. Now therefore let Pharaoh select discerning wise men and set them over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint an overseer over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming to store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. For the food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so the land may not perish through the famine. Whew! That was a lot of reading. But when you look at what God does, isn't that amazing? He gives an ungodly Pharaoh who worshiped false gods a dream telling him what he was going to do. And then there just happens to be this guy who got sold into slavery, got sold to Potiphar, got thrown in jail, who interpreted a dream for a guy in Pharaoh's court, who now stands before Pharaoh interpreting these dreams. Now we read that in rapid succession and go, wow, that's pretty cool. But look at the way God worked through years and years to bring Joseph to that point. Would have been quite strange if Joseph came out of the land where Jacob was and all of this just rose to number 2 for no reason. You see, God's provision for Joseph was great. He was with him. And if we continue to read in Acts chapter 7, verse 11, Stephen speaks of this famine that came upon the land of Egypt and Canaan. He says, now there came a famine throughout all Egypt and Canaan, and great affliction, and our fathers could find no food. So the problem was this famine didn't just affect Egypt, did it? It affected all of Canaan, all of the surrounding region. And so you get to a point where Joseph's family is without food. And so what do? Does anybody remember this part of the story?
Yeah.
What do? They go to Egypt to get some food. Now, they go to Egypt. They go to get some food. And did they recognize Joseph? Did Joseph recognize them? You bet he did. Now, we know there are some crazy turn of events that happened. Benjamin actually ends up being made to stay there while they sent back, and they come back. And then Joseph reveals himself. He says, it's I, Joseph, your brother whom you sold into slavery. And Joseph is he's bawling his brains out. He's united with his brothers. And his brothers are probably like thinking, we're dead. He's going to kill us. There's no way he forgot that we sold him to this place. But we know that was God's provision for them, was it not? Joseph brought his entire family. He says, bring them all. Now 75 in number. He says, come, bring them here. I'll take care of you. I'll take care of you. Is that not a picture of God's grace? You see, and what Stephen is trying to emphasize to these stale, crusty, old elders of Israel is to say, you know what? You have missed the point. It was by grace that he called Abraham out of his father's house to a land. It was by grace alone that he gave him the promise. And now, was it not by the grace of God that he preserved that promise through the patriarchs and through Joseph? Is it not the grace and mercy of God at work on the nation's behalf? You see, what had happened is the nation of Israel had grown self-righteous, and they had become independent of God. They didn't really need God, even though they went through the motions of trying to serve him. Their hearts were far from him. They looked clean on the outside, but the inside was dirty, as Jesus said. They needed to be born again, as Jesus told Nicodemus in John chapter 3. In verse 13 of chapter 7, on the second visit, Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and Joseph's family became known to Pharaoh. And Joseph sent and summoned Jacob, his father, and his kindred, 75 persons in all. And Jacob went down into Egypt, and he died, he and our fathers. And they were carried back to Shechem and laid in a tomb that Abraham had bought for a sum of silver from the sons of Hamor in Shechem. You see, what's interesting here is even though they died there, God wasn't done with them, was he? In fact, as we're going to continue reading here for the next couple minutes, but as the time of promise drew near, which God granted to Abraham, the people increased and multiplied in Egypt until there arose over Egypt another king who did not know Joseph. So here, the nation of Israel flourishes. They grow in number. To the point where Pharaoh, this new king of Egypt, takes note and he says, this isn't good. If we don't deal with these people harshly and shrewdly, then the problem is they're going to grow in number and they're going to overtake us. And so what does he do? It says he dealt with them shrewdly. With our race and forced our fathers to expose their infants so that they would not be kept alive. Remember how Moses was saved? Didn't his mom put him in a basket and put him out in the river in front of Pharaoh's palace? Daughter of Pharaoh found him, but why was his mom even hiding him in the first place? Does anybody remember? What was the order of Pharaoh? Kill all the baby boys. Get rid of them. We got to control this population. But yet, even with Moses, did God not provide? You see did you see the pattern that Stephen is setting up for these elders? Look at the bigger picture of who we are as a nation. It's not about our heritage or our circumcision. It's the fact that we serve the one true and living God who loves us and provides for us and has been faithful to us and sent his only son to us so that we might be saved. You see, that's the point they were missing. And that's where Stephen is ultimately taking them. Even they were made to give up their infants so they wouldn't be kept alive. And at this time, Moses was born, and he was beautiful in God's sight. And he was brought up for 3 months in his father's house. I like the way that Stephen describes Moses. And he was beautiful in his sight. You think about that for just a second. I'm sure it wasn't just that Moses was a good-looking baby, but that Moses had a part to play in what God was doing. And so he looks at him and he says, you know what? For 3 months you can live in your father's house, and then I'm going to send you to Pharaoh's house, but guess what? I'm going to let your mom come and nurse you some more and take care of you until you are of age and will start being taken care of. And when he was exposed, Pharaoh's daughter adopted him and brought him up as her own. And Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptian, and he was mighty in his words and deeds. I love Stephen's sermon. Does anybody else?
Yeah.
Like, if you're one of these people sitting on the Sanhedrin, what do you say to that? Well, I can't argue with you, Stephen. Everything you're saying is spot on with everything that we teach. Everything that we instruct our young people. And Stephen's not just a man of God full of wisdom. He would have been well versed in these things because these are the things that they taught Hebrew boys from the time they were old enough to basically be able to read and think. You will learn your nation's history. And it's interesting that as he stands before these wise men of Israel, quote unquote, and he instructs them not of the truth of Jesus at first, but the faithfulness of God to them. And how if they were going to believe all that God had done for them in the past, why is it so hard for you to believe that Jesus is the Son of God, whom God sent to fulfill his promise that he made to Abraham? Why is it so hard to believe? Do you ever ask yourself that question? Why is it so hard to believe that there is a God who not only is holy and perfect, but loves us enough in our sinfulness to send his Son, Jesus Christ, to die for us? Why is that so hard to believe? Well, I can think back to my own experience and realize it's because we want to hold on to things that are ungodly. We want to live in ways that are focused on us. We want to do what we want to do, not what God wants to do. And isn't that what the nation of Israel had become? A nation of people who claimed to follow God but didn't know him. And now Stephen stands before them, arrested, falsely accused, and is now really preaching the message they all really need to hear. So next week we're going to pick up Stephen's sermon. We're going to look at verse 23 and what God did to bring his people out of the land of Egypt. Familiar stories to us, yes, but important ones for us to remember. And I like what Stephen does because he reminds us, as well as the Sanhedrin, of God's faithfulness to his people. And who are the people of God now? We are. Not that we've replaced or supplanted Israel, but as the church, we are now the chosen people of God for this time in which we live. And how easy it is for us to get wrapped up in traditions and institutions and the way we think things should be rather than trusting God to our fullest. It's easy for us to do, just like it was easy for the nation of Israel to do. And may we heed Stephen's warning to remember God's faithfulness in all that we do. I'm thankful for the praises that we had tonight because I was reminded of God's faithfulness in all the little things. Even Brenda saying, I'm thankful for all the people throughout the years who brought me to church. I can sit here and echo that sentiment as well. I wouldn't be here unless somebody invited me. Faithful people of God. And if we look throughout this story, isn't that what it is? Faithful people of God who trusted God and God used in incredible ways. As we close tonight, I want you guys to think about that. How can God use you? What is God desiring to do in your life? How is God desiring to use you to impact the lives of other people? Maybe you're like Jospeh and you're sitting in quote-unquote prison, not knowing what's happening. But are you trusting him? Are you looking to him? Are you following him? Letting him work in the situations and circumstances that you are in the middle of right now. Knowing that one day they could lead to something greater. Something bigger than yourself. God is faithful and he wants to use us for his glory and his name's sake. The question becomes, will we let him, like Jospeh and like Abraham, as we're going to see, like Moses? Let's pray. God, thank you so much for your love and grace. Thank you for this day. Thank you for the truth of your word. Thank you for the reminder. God, as we think back to the stories of Jospeh and Abraham and Moses next week, Lord, that we get to walk through history, God, and see how good you are as we see how you worked in the lives of so many that have come before us. God, may that be an inspiration to us, to spur us on, to keep on fighting the good fight of faith, to walking and remaining steadfast so that we can see your work and your will be done. God, thank you for your love. Again, thank you for Jesus who died so that we could have a relationship with you. It's in your son's name we pray. Amen.
So I'll see you tonight, Jeremy.